She will testify that she learned Chris Regan's vehicle had been at the park and ride on US 2 in Bates Township since October 15, 2014, and that she was able to gain access to his apartment, which was unlocked and disheveled. Terry O'Donnell will tell you anything out of place in Chris Regan's apartment was unusual, and that calls to Chris Regan's cell phone went directly to voicemail. She told Chief Rizzo she had heard he was seeing a woman from work named Kelly. Chief Rizzo turned the missing person complaint over to Sergeant Barrett for that evening. Terry O'Donnell told Sergeant Barrett she had looked in the window of Chris Regan's vehicle at the park and ride and found his water and spittoon bottle in the car, and that he never left either one behind. Sergeant Barrett and Terry O'Donnell proceeded to check out Chris Regan's apartment. While there, Sergeant Barrett noticed the home was in disarray. To-do lists and paperwork regarding employment were on the dining room table. Included in the paperwork was the accepted offer letter and the email regarding the drug test. Sergeant Barrett and Terry O'Donnell next went to the park and ride. Sergeant Barrett checked the vehicle and found it locked. No keys inside. She noticed 2 plastic water bottles, the spittoon and the water for rinsing his mouth after he chewed. There was a hat and gloves on the driver's seat, wedged towards the back of the seat, a knee brace on the passenger seat, and a yellow Post-it note face down on the passenger seat. Sergeant Barrett was able to unlock the doors that set off the alarms. She picked up the yellow Post-it note and noted what appeared to be directions. She used various means to try and make contact with Chris Regan that night. She called the VA, she checked his cell, she contacted Verizon Wireless and asked them to ping his phone, without success. Officers were able to determine Kelly Cochran was the woman Chris Regan had been seeing from work, and Sergeant Barrett and Michigan State Police Trooper Boyer went to her home that evening at 66 Lawrence Street. Upon arrival, officers saw a person look out an upstairs window just prior to someone exiting the front door. Jason Cochran had exited the front door. He advised them that Kelly Cochran was not home, but would not tell officers where she was. He told officers to return in an hour and she should be home. When asked if anyone else was home, Jason Cochran said no. Just at that moment, the defendant exited the door and identified herself as Kelly Cochran. The defendant advised she'd sent him some texts and tried to call him, but he didn't reply. Defendant was asked whether her husband knew about her relationship with Chris Regan, and she advised he did and that he was fine with it. She said there were no problems between her husband and Chris Regan. She was informed of his car being found at the park and ride and responded, he loved that car. The defendant told officers everything was going good in Chris Regan's life and she was given a card to contact the department. On the screen right now is the note that was found in Chris Regan's car, and if you follow the directions, it takes you to Kelly Cochran's home. Officers began their investigation into Chris Regan's disappearance. They began trying to narrow down his last steps before he went missing and determine who saw him last, whether he was suicidal, whether he wanted to disappear, whether anyone wanted to harm him. Officers began pulling in people for interviews. On October 28, 2014, Jason Cochran and Kelly Cochran were interviewed at the Iron River Police Department separately. Those interviews were recorded. During this interview, the defendant advises officers she'd go over to Chris Regan's house 5-6 nights a week for dinner. That he had come over to her house 2 to 3 times before, with the last time being 2 to 3 weeks prior to the interview. She said her husband knew what was going on and Chris wasn't the only one she was seeing. Her husband accepted these relationships. She advised her husband had lots of medical issues and couldn't do anything physical without being in a lot of pain. According to the defendant, these relationships didn't cause any problems between her and Jason. She said Jason couldn't work, so she took care of all the bills. On October 28, 2014, when asked about the last time she saw Chris Regan, she said about 2 weeks ago. She narrowed it down to between October 12th and 15th, and then said probably would have been the 13th or 14th. She would have gone over to his house for dinner that night. He usually went to bed around 7:30 p.m., and she usually went over to his house around 4:30 p.m. The 14th, she drove by his apartment several times and went up there and knocked on the door once. Later, when asked, she told detectives she had a key and went into his apartment after knocking. She had never seen his apartment so disorganized. When asked what Jason did while she was at work, she said he walks a lot and goes fishing at the Caspian Pit. She told detectives she and Jason had the same phone, with phone number 367-0066. They used to have two, but at the interview time, they only had one. She said her old phone number was 284-3947, and they got rid of her phone because it was an extra expense they didn't need. Officers asked defendant if she thought Jason would hurt Chris. Defendant said he wouldn't want to hurt her, which is why he wouldn't hurt Chris. Everything he had ever done was to make her happy. When asked if Jason ever threatened to hurt her, she said no. He was suicidal. He was depressed. He had a thought about it, but if someone said it was a threat, it was misinterpreted. He has never thought more clearly, and she was a girl who could take care of herself. He never hit her. He never abused her. She agreed that day to a consent search of her cell phone, and her cell phone was given over to detectives at that time. She does tell detectives that day that she had nothing to do with his disappearance and that she was actually a little bit upset with him, that he was blowing her off. Jason Cochran was interviewed by detectives after Kelly Cochran. Unlike the defendant, Jason became emotional during his interview, crying at times. He started off the interview telling officers he sees a counselor for high anxiety and was institutionalized a little over a month ago. He said he knew about his wife's extramarital affairs and wasn't happy about it, but he had to accept it or let her go. Said his marriage was rocky, and he blamed it all on himself, on his health issues, that he couldn't move around or function the way he used to. He said she was now spending a lot more time with him in the past 2 or 3 weeks prior to the October 28th interview. He said that he took a forensic course in college and guest officers wanted to talk to him because they believed him to be the jealous husband. He talked about fishing at the pit and walking for hours from his home in Caspian up to the library or along Apple Blossom Trail and back. Said he never threatened to kill the defendant and went to the hospital because he was suicidal. When asked about their cell phone use, he said they had only been sharing that phone for a few days, and she had used his phone from time to time in the past. He said that they had decided to work on things in their marriage when he got out of the hospital. There's never been abuse between either one of them, by her or by him. He said he didn't know the last time his wife saw Chris, and when asked how things were between he and his wife at the time of the interview, he said the last week or so it's been better. He's been able to function more, they've been spending more time together. In early November, officers were able to do an extraction from the defendant's phone and remove some of the content from the phone for viewing. On the screen now are messages between the defendant and Christopher Regan, setting up a date for October 14th, 2014. Chris Regan on October 13th sends to Kelly. Sure wish I knew if you're okay or not. Please let me know. Okay? Hope you are. Kelly says, oh my God, don't hate me.
I'll object at this point. We got a lot of things already in evidence here. I'm okay with some demonstrations of pictures and things of this nature, but none of this has been admitted as of yet. The evidence.
No, I thought you had, the two of you have agreed.
We agree on a lot of things, but then I haven't seen exactly what's going to coming up here, coming forward here, and what is here, what is
Follow?
All the items that I am using now are items that were stipulated to.
in that case, I would try my objection, so I'm not sure. Thank you.
Kelly's response at 1:35 p.m. Oh my God, don't hate me. Lost contacts. I did get you a gift on my trip. 1:36 p.m. Kelly says, I was going to stop at your place, but figured you wouldn't hear me knock. 1:36 p.m. Chris says, come over tonight. Got some juicy gossip to share. 1:37, Kelly says, can't give you your gift till tomorrow. Tomorrow better? Chris says at 1:37, I thought you fell off the face of the earth. I would not have heard you knocking. I sleep sound now. Chris says, 1:38 p.m., okay, how come? She says, I have been sick and crabby, that's why. Chris says, so I am sick too. You could use a hug and some kind words. See you at 5? 4:15 p.m., she responds. I feel like my head is in a vice. 4:17 p.m., poor girl, maybe you'll feel a little better tomorrow. Sound better? She says, I'm hoping this sucks. You okay? He says, I'll survive. Glad to get the cold thing over. She says, you better. Lucky you. Mine had drained down for a week almost. He says, drink liquids and a multivitamin, some food, and bundle up, watch TV. She says, I always take multivitamins and drink lots. Oh, you meant what? Huh? I'll try that, and TV makes me lazy, so I can't do that. He says, that's the idea, dork. Rest. She says, I'm trying, it's not easy for me. At 6:05 p.m., Kelly says good night. Chris says, sleep well, see you tomorrow. Kelly says at 6:17, I can't wait, I've missed you. Sorry to be so cheesy. Chris says, it has been a long time, at least it seems. I can't wait either, smiling. Officers also interviewed the defendant and her husband again on October 31st, 2014, and at that time they obtained Jason Cochran's phone. During that time, they asked both Kelly Cochran and Jason Cochran about inconsistencies in their story, the time frame of when the defendant last saw Chris, and their phone records. Fast forward to March 2015. Kelly Cochran and Jason Cochran are still saying, I had nothing to do with his disappearance. Officers believe at that time that they have enough to execute a search warrant on the Cochran residence, and they go in and do a partial search of the residence, focusing on the front entryway and other areas of interest. During the search warrant, the defendant and her husband wait in the police officer's car and later go over to their friend's, Saylor's home. Jason Cochran had made friends with David Saylor, Todd Saylor, and Carolyn Myantek. Eventually, the defendant started going over to the Saylor's house as well, and she became friends with them. During the search warrant, evidence technicians seized many items after they fluoresced for possible blood. A .22 revolver, ceiling tiles, baseball bat, carpet sections, screws, hinges, and they also seized additional cellular phones and a computer. The next day, after March 5th, 2015, the Cochrans were gone, disappeared, left and went back to Indiana. Their family members came to Michigan and packed up their belongings and brought them back to Indiana. But in the nearly 2 years since, neither Jason Cochran nor Kelly Cochran have been back to their home without being escorted by police. Between March 15, 2015 and July 2015, further search warrants were executed for electronic devices, and a second search of Cochran's home was on March 27. During that time, additional items were seized. A comforter, .22 ammunition, 30-06 ammunition, 380 cartridges, 12-gauge shotgun shells, keys, notebooks. The garage was searched and a part of the wall leading to the basement was taken. To date, the only gun that had been seized was a .22 revolver that was the only one that had been found. One of the writings that was seized appeared to have been written by Jason Cochran and was separated in chapters where the main character describes himself as a hunter, a predator, who hangs a sign over his door reading, if you're not invited, you're not welcome, enter at your own risk. The main character in that book describes that smell or the tingle and that predators are evil and have a smell about them. Laboratory results start trickling in during this time, and it's determined that DNA from both the defendant and Jason Cochran was needed to compare to possible DNA on items collected via search warrants. In May 2015, a human remains dog hit on a portion of the Caspian pit. A dive team searched that area where the dog hit and found a burn barrel with a cement block attached via clothesline. Neighbors had indicated Kelly Cochran and Jason Cochran had a burn barrel in the fall of 2014. When the house was searched in March of 2015, there wasn't a burn barrel. Specifically, one neighbor who will testify recalls Cochran's burning something with a god-awful smell in October of 2014, like nothing that he'd ever smelled before. The burn barrel was no longer, In May 2015, officers again searched the property. There was a fire pit and ash in the Cochran's backyard. The ash was excavated, and as sifting of the ash revealed, the officers found a blade saw, a blade saw, and the metal grommets from a pair of old Navy jeans. Additional search warrants were executed during May and June as more information became known. Other items taken were a hairbrush, the fire pit ash and findings, drywall, wood from the east entry door, and hair samples. In July, officers traveled to Indiana to serve search warrants on Kelly and Jason Cochran. These were executed with the assistance of the Lake County, Indiana CSI unit, with the samples being turned over to the Iron River Police Department. During that time, officers met with Jason Kelly Cochran, and Jason Cochran confirmed the handwriting in the notebook containing the predator story was his. Defendant also conversed with officers. Chief Rizzo had asked her in November of 2014 if she knew where the parking lot at Bates Township was. She denied knowing what it was or where it was. Chief Frizzo again asked her in July of 2015 if she wanted to change her statement about whether she knew where the parking ride was. She again said she did not know where the parking ride was. Chief Frizzo knew this to be a lie because she had seen Kelly Cochran's text regarding the parking ride. In August of 2015, the FBI becomes involved in the case. Their evidence response team, after briefing by Iron PD, executed a search warrant at the defendant's residence. Again, more items taken: another baseball bat, a rabbit's book, a sledgehammer head, a bucket, trash can, samples from the shower trap, washing machine agitator, things like that. This evidence was hand-delivered to the FBI's lab in Quantico, Virginia, by FBI agent Jay Johnston and Iron River Police Officer Anthony Silva. In November 2015, FBI agents execute search warrants in Indiana for the defendant's truck, their dog, and their fingerprints. When I say dog, they were looking for hair samples. Human remains dogs first searched the truck and gave positive indications on the vehicle. Various samples were taken from the vehicle at that time, including swabs and tools. Also during this time, FBI agents met with the defendant and Jason Cochran. Officers informed them that the presence of blood was noted in their house, the samples were taken and at the lab, an arrest warrant was in their future. In February 2016, specifically February 20th, 2016, Jason Cochran dies in Indiana. This changes the case. Right after Jason Cochran dies, Detective Jeremy Ogden from the Hobart, Indiana Police Department becomes involved in the case. He begins interviewing Jason Cochran's friends, family members. Chief Frizzo sends him what existed at that time of Iron River Police Department's case file. He reviews the entire file and comes up with a plan that he believes will help the Iron River investigation. He decides to use a CI to call the defendant on a recorded line. This CI was a friend of Jason Cochran's as well as the defendant. He agrees to this plan and to call the defendant. During the call, which was after Jason Cochran's death on March 12, 2016, he tells her that shortly before his death, Jason Cochran sent him a letter. Within the letter was another letter addressed to Iron River Police Department with instructions that if anything happened to Jason Cochran, the CI was to immediately deliver the letter to the Iron River Police Department. Kelly Cochran's response was she did not want the letter sent. This letter never existed. After the letter call, Detective Ogden was able to establish a rapport with the defendant in a strange way. He told her she could either be a witness or a suspect in Chris Regan's murder. The fellow Kelly Cochran chose to be a witness. From that point on, her story changed from never being afraid of Jason Cochran a day in her life to being a victim who was afraid of her husband. She told Detective Ogden on March 29, 2016, that Chris died quickly. That Jason shot Chris in the back of the head and that she saw it happen. That Chris was coming over to her house and Jason was supposed to be gone, but what she didn't know was that Jason Cochran was waiting for them in the basement and that he shot Chris Regan in the back of the head. That Jason Cochran was waiting for them and shot Chris Regan in the back of the head upstairs in her bedroom while she and Chris were having sex. So the first story was that they were upstairs when he was shot. Detective Ogden was able to persuade Kelly Cochran to drive with officers from Indiana to Michigan so she could show them where Chris's body was. Once in Michigan, she showed officers an area to search on Pentoga Trail. It was closer to US 2. Detective Ogden took the defendant to her home while they were in Michigan, where they performed a video reenactment of how Chris was murdered. Her story changed once she arrived at her house. Rather than saying Chris was shot upstairs while they were having sex by Jason, she said that Jason was waiting for Chris in the basement, that she thought Jason was gone, and that she and Chris both fell down the basement stairs after Chris was shot. So she denied knowing that Jason was in the home at that time. She said Chris died immediately and that Jason pointed a gun at her while she was in the basement and fired 2 rounds. She said she was scared, that he demanded she dig the bullet out of Chris Regan's head with a pair of forceps. She said they took Chris's car to the park and ride in Bates Township and returned to their home. She gave Jason Cochran the cord for the Sawzall, and Jason Cochran began cutting up Chris into pieces and putting him in black garbage bags. She says she refused to carry the garbage bags up the stairs, so Jason put them in the back of the pickup truck. Defendant then says she drove the truck to Pentoga Trail, where Jason dumped the pieces of Chris Regan into the woods on the side of the road. She said he brought the garbage bags back to the truck where they were later disposed of in the regular trash pickup. Once she returned home, she claimed Jason Cochran demanded she cook him dinner and clean up the blood that covered the basement floor. April 26th is Chris Regan's birthday. The defendant talked with both Chief Rizzo and Detective Ogden on that date. She had told Detective Ogden on the way home from Michigan in March of 2016 that there were others that Jason had killed. During a phone call with Chief Rizzo on Chris's birthday, she tells Chief Rizzo that Jason Cochran had trophies, that she found them, took them, and buried them right next to the location where they dumped Chris Regan's body. But she told Chief Rizzo that she buried them before they dumped Chris Regan's body there. When asked how Jason Cochran knew where to dump Chris's body, she told Chief Rizzo she drove Jason Cochran to that spot so the body would be placed by the trophy bed. On April 27th and 28th, Detective Ogden received some weird texts from the defendant that make him believe she's leaving Indiana. He continues to text her in the hopes that she'd turn her phone on and off so that he could ping it. On April 28th, a warrant for Kelly Cochran's arrest was issued by Iron County, and the detective was successful in pinging her phone. She was arrested by U.S. Marshals in Kentucky at a family member's house. Late on April 28, 2016, Detective Ogden and Detective Steve Houck from the Hobart Police Department receive a call from the Graves County, Kentucky jail. The defendant wanted to give a statement. Detectives drove all night and arrived at the jail to take her statement. During a lengthy interview on April 30th, 2016 at the jail, the defendant tells detectives she and Jason planned to kill Chris Regan. That Jason was going to go over to Chris's apartment October 13th, 2014 and kill him. But she stopped him because she knew that plan would fail, that he would never get away with it. She told detectives she lured him to her house, lured Chris to her house so that this murder could be carried out. That Chris's death wasn't her choice, and that Chris had never been to her residence before October 14th, 2014. That was his first time. She said the plan was for her to originally kill Chris Regan by kicking him or pushing him down the basement stairs, where Jason was waiting with the .22. She couldn't do it, so instead she gave him sex, knowing Jason was going to kill him if she did not follow through. During this same interview, on April 30th, 2016 in Kentucky, the defendant tells the detective that she has killed before numerous times, that she doesn't count Chris Regan as her kill because Jason had to do it. He was Jason's kill. She gives some information to detectives about additional victims. Also during this interview, the defendant tells detectives that she and Jason had a murder pact that was made on their wedding night. If one of them were to cheat, then they had to kill the person they cheated with, or the other spouse would kill them. On May 16, 2016, the defendant arrives in the Iron County jail. She's arraigned, and after arraignment tells Chief Rizzo she wants to take the police to Chris Regan's remains. Chief Rizzo makes arrangements with the jail, law enforcement officers, and a cadaver dog to begin another search for his remains. Defendant is allowed to accompany detectives on a search for his body on May 17, 2016. Defendant and the officers go to Pintoga Trail. After driving up and down the road for a bit, the defendant tells officers to stop and get out. She takes officers to a tree that was down on the ground and indicates she believes that's the spot. The human remains dog is turned loose and hits on a black garbage bag not far from the tree indicated by the defendant. At that time, no remains are found. Defendant, also on May 17, 2016, takes investigators to Wildwood Lake and points out to them where she threw Chris Regan's camera that she took from his apartment while there on October 15th or 16th of 2014. Also on May 17th, she takes officers to her home. She shows them where a part of the gun used to kill Chris Regan was hidden in the house. She further shows some items of interest in the basement, where Chris Regan's body was cut up with a sawzall, where she claimed she hid 2 bullet casings from Jason allegedly shooting at her, and where a piece of skull fragment was supposed to be. While also there, an officer noticed forceps on the kitchen counter next to a dish strainer. She advised officers those were the forceps she used to try and dig the bullet out of Chris Regan's skull. The forceps were seized. Still, again, on May 17th, she takes officers to another location, the Caspian Pit. While there, she points out to officers where part of the murder weapon was thrown and discusses how she carried it in her pant leg to the pit before it was thrown into the water. She's taken back to jail that day. Chief Rizzo and Alyssa Palmer, who was a cadaver dog handler, decided to make one more run with the dog late afternoon out of Pintoga Trail. They arrived out there and the dog took off into an open field, not far from the tree that was pointed out by the defendant. Neither the handler nor Chief Rizzo knew what the dog was doing. The dog started barking at something in the field. As Chief Rizzo and the handler approached, Chief Rizzo saw something that looked like a volleyball or a rock out in the field. Chief Rizzo drew near and realized to her horror, amazement, and her relief that it was a human skull. Chris Reagan's final resting place had been found. In September 2016, a forensic odontologist compared known dental records of Chris Regan with the skull that was found, and a positive identification was made. The medical examiner ruled Chris Regan's death a homicide by gunshot wound. Kelly and Jason Cochran were bonded in blood. As you can see from these text messages, what was a failing marriage in August and September of 2014 became a love fest after Chris Regan was killed on October 14th, 2014. And these are a little bit difficult for you to read. But on September 9th of 2014, Kelly texts Jason at 4:21 a.m., "Quit going through my shit." Jason texts back, "I need to trust you, please help. I am tired of feeling lied to. I know you keep showing me your new friends are more important. Anything for them while I have to beg to use our truck or I have to walk." 9:10 a.m., Kelly says, "Can't take it anymore." Jason says, "I am done fighting. You put me in my place." At 9:15, "I am your bitch. You will lie and I will keep loving you." You next see in October of 2014, October 19th, Kelly texts her husband and says, "Handsome." October 20th, she texts him and says, "I'm at the doctor now. I made it in time. You thought I woke up late. I'll call after I'm done to see if you need anything. Before I have, you make me bacon and then fuck me." October 21st, she tells her husband at 5:36 p.m., "Hope you got enough rest." October 21st, she texts her husband, "I love you." October 21st, he texts back, "You better love me." She texts him, "I meant I still like you." Except, actually, I'm reading this backwards. She texts him, "You suck, but I still like you." And he says, "You better love me." And she says, "I do love you. Hope you got enough rest." Sorry about that. At the end of this case, the people are going to be requesting you find the defendant guilty of all charges. But in particular, we're going to be asking that you find the defendant guilty of aiding and abetting Jason Cochran in the murder of Christopher Carl Regan by plotting and planning his death and luring him to his funeral. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Shelby, do you choose to give your opening now?
I do, sir. Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, thank you for your patience this morning. Thank you for your service here. I know you all have things you ought to be doing. Saw a lot of trepidation yesterday when I passed, and y'all went from being prospective jurors to serving on the jury. I think I saw a couple of you mouthing some naughty words. It's okay. I feel bad for you. I understand. I feel your pain. I just ask you, thank you for your service. Ms. Cochran, thanks you for your service. As the judge has indicated, I'm not obligated at this time to give my opening statement. I would have an option to wait until after Ms. Paul presents her case in chief. It's going to take a while. I want to, at this time, kind of give you a sneak preview, kind of coming attractions of where I'm going to be going and some things that I want you to be paying attention to while the prosecution witnesses are testifying. So I'm not going to go through every detail or all the details that Ms. Paul did. Again, I'm going to just talk about some broad themes I want you to pay attention to. Ms. Paul did a very good job of introducing you to Ms. Cochran. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her. She's 35. Again, she comes originally from Indiana, a small town outside of Gary, near Chicago area. Folks still live down there. I think you're going to get to meet her parents, assuming that Ms. Paul still calls them as witnesses. Ms. Cochran has two brothers. She has a big sister. She's She's a high school graduate, and she went to Purdue University, graduated in 2013. Now, as Ms. Paul also told you that Ms. Cochran was married to a gentleman named Jason, so that's a picture up there. He has passed away. And again, as we talked about yesterday, you've promised that you're not going to speculate or wonder as to the cause of death or anything like that, or why a law enforcement became involved, law enforcement entity became involved. Again, you promised that you put that behind you, and I respectfully request that you continue to abide by that promise. Now again, you heard Ms. Paul talk about a lot about this case, a lot of the facts that she laid out here, gave you a nice little timeline here today. I'll let you know, Ms. Cochran and I, in large measure, do not dispute a lot of those facts. You've heard, and I'm going to give you the quick and dirty version of it here. Ms. Cochran moved up here with her husband from Indiana, started a job over at Oldenburg, which I think is also known as Lakeshore, met Mr. Regan, started a relationship, had another relationship, and then that caused some marital issues. Again, we're not disputing any of this. You've also heard from Ms. Paul about how Mr. Regan passed away. Again, in some measure, we don't concede the facts there either, some of the facts. We'll concede and we believe that the evidence will show that Mr. Regan was shot in the head, his body was dismembered, and was left in the woods off the Dover Trail. Again, while I've simplified the story greatly and gave you a quick rundown without going into detail upon detail, I think that this kind of gives you the general chain of events back in October of 2014. Now, there are things I certainly don't agree with Ms. Paul about, obviously. If we agree on everything, you wouldn't be here right now, we wouldn't be here right now. You know, the devil's in the details, that's the saying that you hear. In essence, you're going to hear two versions of the story. One version is the version that you have the prosecutor talk about today. My client worked with her now deceased husband in concert with him to murder, dismember, and dispose of Mr. Regan. Obviously, we dispute that. We believe that the evidence will show that Jason, Mr. Cochran, acted alone in the murder of Mr. Regan, and that Kelly had no knowledge of that was going to happen. Further, we believe that the evidence will show that in regard to this dismemberment, disposal of the body, that Jason again was the driving force in these acts, and that any role that Kelly had as a result of her fearing for her life and safety. Again, as I mentioned, Ms. Paul gets to present her case first. It'll be some time before you hear from my witnesses. Hopefully not too long. Hopefully we can move things along rather quickly. Again, I want to give you a little coming attractions version of what they are likely to testify to. You've heard some allusions to it right now when Ms. Paul was speaking. They'll tell you about the mental health issues that Mr. Cochran suffered. They'll tell you about a hospitalization that he had in a mental health facility over in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. That's weeks before Mr. Regan's disappearance. They'll tell you about Mr. Cochran's demeanor and acts. Again, when you hear from these witnesses, I'd ask that you keep an open mind. And again, that's coming down the road. Now, the people have approximately 50 witnesses on their list. Each and every one of them are reported witnesses. They're all going to add a piece to this puzzle. I want you to listen to what they have to say. However, none of these people can tell you with any certainty what happened in that house in Cascade in October of 2014. None were there. These are folks that have heard things through interviews. These are folks who talked to witnesses. These are folks that have worked in labs and ran tests. And they are going to give their perception of what they've heard, what they've told, and what their tests or their occupation has shown them. Each of them are important. Each of them are certainly worthy of your attention. However, there are three people who know what happened in that home. That's Mr. Regan, Mr. Cochran, and Kelly. And Kelly's the only one who has told her story. Now again, as you probably gleaned, this is Ms. Powell's version of events is largely predicated or based on what Kelly had told officers and others. You're going to hear from these folks. You're going to hear what Kelly told them. I'll tell you right now, you're going to hear, and you've already seen it, numerous versions of the story. Facts were added, facts were deleted, things were changed. story has evolved. To be frank, Kelly gave a bit of a moving target here, and when she told what happened. And I believe that when you hear from the officers and others that have taken statements from Kelly, you're going to see that as well. And again, Ms. Hall did an excellent job of outlining that in her presentation here, that there have been inconsistencies. Well, there have been inconsistencies, there have all been things that have not changed. And I think it's important that when you pay attention to each time that Ms. Cochran spoke with someone, that you pay attention to more than just what was said. It's kind of like that old Paul Harvey on the radio that we'd hear, the rest of the story. I want you to hear the story, but I want you to consider the rest of the story. I want you to consider the demeanor and circumstances of the interview. I want you to consider the backstory. I want you to consider what will be said, and also consider where, when, how, and perhaps even if you can discern why it was said. Again, I will concede there are inconsistencies here. But again, as you hear these witnesses coming up here, I want you to focus not only on the consistencies, but the consistencies and the rest of the story. Again, there's another analogy. I think you probably all heard it. It's a bit cliche. There's the iceberg that you see floating out in the ocean. You see the tip, and the rest of it's underwater. You don't know what's there. Again, I want you to look not only at the tip of the iceberg, but try to envision the entire iceberg. Look under the water. And again, I want you to do that for each and every witness that you hear. Now, jury trial, I think as we've mentioned, is the search for the truth. As jurors, it's going to be your job to listen to the evidence and determine the truth as to what truly happened to Mr. Regan. Or there's an added wrinkle to this that we talked about yesterday. Well, I anticipate that both myself and Ms. Powell will tell their version of the story. It's not as simple as picking one or the other. It's not, I like Ms. Powell's version, I like Mr. Schulte's version better. As you were told yesterday, I thought we don't have to do a thing. I didn't have to get up here right now. I don't have to put witnesses on. I don't have to question anyone. The burden is on the people. And they need to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to prove each and every element of each charge beyond a reasonable doubt. And again, you have promised to hold the people to their burden. If you Google justice and get online, don't be doing that now because you're not supposed to be Googling things. You see the woman holding the scale, and the scales are usually balanced. When I think of trials and evidence as one side putting weight on the scale, and then it's your job to consider how much weight each witness, each piece of testimony, each piece of evidence tilts down that scale, one way or the other. Versus the people, versus the defense. One way or the other. That's your job in evaluating evidence and witnesses. And again, it's your job to evaluate how far, if at all, that scale is moved. Ms. Cochran is going to present some evidence too. I anticipate that happening. Again, you're going to have to evaluate the evidence and that scale when you consider their testimony and their evidence as well. Again, it's essential, as I stated, that you hear not only what they're saying, but again, look at the circumstances around what they're saying. Now again, we've all promised to hold the state to the burden, and you're going to have to consider, at the end of this, the state has put enough weight, enough evidence on their side of the scale to weigh it down sufficiently for you to determine that they have met their burden of proving Ms. Cochran guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's up to you to determine how far that burden has to be, where that line is, how far does that scale need to tilt. Again, I want to thank you for your service. All I can ask is to listen carefully. If you don't hear anything, please put your hands up and let us know. And use your best judgment. And I think after this is all said and done, and you've considered everything, you're going to see that the scale does not tilt sufficiently enough towards people for them to meet their burden. And again, if that's the case, you determine that. You promise me, you promise this court, you promise each other, you promise Ms. Cochran that you will go to acquit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schulte.